This is The Strategic Leader, the podcast that helps people-focused leaders to think, act, and feel more strategic. And in this Series 5, we are exploring Tales from the Top Table. We're looking at the senior leadership team, what's involved in operating strategically in that team, and we've got both guests and our own perspectives to share, and we hope you find it useful.
Hello and welcome back to The Strategic Leader. This is Series 5 and we are talking Tales from the Top Table. So as well as me, Fee Craig, we have our regular co-host Gemma Bullivant.
Hi there.
And Gem, do you want to introduce our guest today?
Yes, today I am really pleased to welcome someone who's worked at a very senior level, Divinia Knowles. Before we bring Divinia Knowles in, I'll just give you a little bit of background. She's worked with founders as a COO, CFO, CEO. She's now working with COOs and helping them to be better and to grow and develop in their roles. She'll tell us a little bit more about that. She's partnered with Packed Coffee, one of the big direct-to-consumer specialty coffee brands. She's even worked with a few A-list celebs, Madonna, Mick Jagger, Sharon Stone. That feels like a whole other podcast episode, if I'm perfectly honest. We probably won't go there, disappointingly, but love to hear more about that over a gin. But welcome, Divinia. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you're doing now.
Thank you. And it's lovely to be here. So thank you for inviting me on the podcast. These days, I am a COO coach. And so I work with COOs in large and small, mainly technology-led businesses to help them grow and develop, as you said, in their roles and in their businesses. I spend half my time doing that and half my time running a community called the COO Roundtable, which is a community of around 250 COOs in different companies in the UK largely. And again, it's coaching inspired, but it encourages them to get together and learn from each other and help coach each other. But it's a privilege to be able to do that as well.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Divinia. As Fee alluded to at the start, what we're really wanting to do here is in our ongoing quest to better understand what it means to be strategic, we're going to take a bit of a deep dive at various roles that might sit around that top table, whatever that top table is, whether it's chiefs and execs and boards, or whether it is more of a senior leadership team within a business. That top table is where we are certainly most expected to operate strategically. And so we'd love some of your perspective, not least as a COO, which obviously has a different perspective, I would imagine, from an ops side of things to some of the other functional areas. Give us a few insight from your perspective, Divinia, how operating strategically has evolved for you.
For me personally, this has been really interesting, and COOs are often defined by doing, and especially if you're a COO that's grown up in a business as I did when I was at Moshi Monsters, because I came up from much more junior roles. So the doing was sort of in my blood. And then trying to learn as I came up through head of operations and finance, and then chief operating officer and chief financial officer to be strategic so that I could then really be an asset on the leadership team and on the board, because I was on the board for 8 years of that business as well. I found that quite a large sort of transition, a different way of thinking, being valued in a different way, needing to set aside time to be able to really corral my thoughts around what the strategy of the business actually was and what my thoughts were on it as well. And it's an interesting one now when I'm coaching chief operating officers that I often go on the same journey with them and say to them, have your own take on what your company is doing and its sort of future and the vision and where it's heading and the market and, competitive landscape, because that's really where you will add a lot of value outside of your doing, corralling, keep getting people together, all of those things that chief operating officers tend to do. So that's normally my encouragement to them, only because I sort of feel like I lived that experience myself.
That's a really interesting one, that idea about looking outside of the business to help create your perspective, because I think that's something that comes with maturity in a way on the whole. with people moving up through the ranks. I remember trying to encourage a team I was in to bring news articles or things that they'd read about competitors or the economy or the marketplace into our team meetings. And it was a real struggle, because I think they were like, well, my job is doing this stuff, the stuff that's in my inbox, the stuff that we'll talk about at the same time. It's not really kind of looking outside, and just trying to encourage people to, how to form an opinion on, as you say, what's our strategic direction of the business and what is my perspective on that is
Mm.
like an extra skill that you have to kind of add in at that stage, isn't it? It doesn't,
Yeah.
it's not just like, okay, here's a strategy, how do I deliver on it? It's, well, here's a strategy and what do I think of it? And is it the right one? And can I bring some kind of objective challenge to it? And can I talk about that in a way that is constructive and generative rather than obstructive and too challenging?
I totally agree. And I think again, for chief operating officers, especially if you're working with, as I was, very visionary founders who are often the external where I was the internal, you then almost in your head, you compartmentalized and said, okay, well, that's their job. And my job then is to look after everything within the business. But I actually think that that possibly is very, very limiting for those C levels. And so being able to then develop that view becomes part of their growth. And also, as you say, being able to then constructively challenge, whether it's in the board or in the leadership team and in general day-to-day execution, what that then, how that translates, what that looks like, I think is really key.
I'm really interested in what you just said about they're the external, I'm the internal. When you've got a visionary founder, for example, or maybe another big character, how have you figured out how to tackle some of the big characters that might be on your team on that top table? And then that point about that's their job, this is my job, big founder type characters, and how that shapes how everybody else shows up in that team.
Well, I think this is such an interesting one. And I do coach some founders also from time to time. And I think they also have an interesting journey that they go on, which is that they are used to, especially as they start their businesses, they often have a very junior team around them to begin with. And they are the person who sets the strategy and they are the word of law. And as those businesses then scale, it becomes quite challenging because they bring in other experienced C levels as part of their scaling journey and have to concede that there are going to be other views around the table and their strategy might not be the one or their version of it might not be the one that is the final version, as in it's probably much better when it's kind of collaborated on and taken apart with other people and then sort of put back together in a slightly different way. Plus, these folks that come in often have other industry expertise and can help to inform and make that strategy better. But I do think that they're then at a founder, CEO, and a scaling business in that way, quite often they struggle because they're used to, okay, but this is what's in my head and this is my vision of the future. Also, it's an interesting personality type thing, I think, because I feel like lots of COOs are actually quite introverted. They don't really mind about not being in the spotlight, all of this sort of thing. So kind of then just putting it out there that they've got a completely different point of view might be very scary and actually not really what they consider to be within their wheelhouse.
That speaks to the three hats that we talked about in the episode 1 of this series feed, doesn't it? But if you haven't caught that episode, do have a listen. We talked about the three hats. Obviously, the first hat is that you are the functional expert in the room. The second hat is that you're also the executive decision maker or an enterprise decision maker. Speaks a little bit to that external view that you were mentioning earlier, and Fee, your example of getting the team to bring some competitor analysis into the room and some of the things that you were talking about, Divinia. And then that third point about personality speaks a little bit to the sort of what you bring, but as part of a team as well. And they were the three hats that we were kicking around there. And Divinia, I know you've got a similar type of model that you work with. Would you be
Yeah,
able to share that with us?
absolutely. I really love this when I was kind of learning about this from you guys. I really love this way of thinking about it. And quite often as well with the COOs that I work with, they can be quite unclear about how to articulate their role to others. You know, they have a sense of kind of the thing that makes them most valuable in the organization. So I developed a very, very similar model called the 3 Rs, because they've all got to have some kind of hook, haven't they?
Okay.
And the R's are role, remit, and relationships in a very similar way. So role being their functional role, because of course chief operating officers don't, quite often they all have different roles. So you might have somebody who's more product oriented, or someone who's more sort of traditional, as in HR, legal, finance. And then you have remit, whereby they obviously have a lot of cross-functional glue that they work with. So kind of they have a remit to operate across the business and to operate sort of on the business as well as in the business, much in the same way a CEO does. And unlike actually some of the other C levels to the same extent. And then the last one is the relationships piece, which is definitely team because of cross-team dependencies in the leadership team and elsewhere. But then also I encourage relationship at board level, relationship across the team below. So relationships everywhere, because quite often the COO becomes the greatest influencer as well, sort of working through everybody, some through reporting lines, other through pure influencing relationships. But yeah, so I love this characterization because they require a different mindset and way of thinking about things, pure sort of functional execution versus remit across the business and working on a business. And then how am I interrelating with everybody? And again, this is sort of where my coaching work goes with lots of the COOs that I work with. Are they thinking about these different realms in the right way or at all? Or are they sort of narrowly considering their function and not necessarily thinking about some of these other things?
So that's interesting. I mean, you have two perspectives on this. One is your own experience at this level, and the other is all of the many people at this level that you have coached yourself. So hearing all their stories as well as your own. But what do you think people struggle with when they get to that top table, they get to that kind of role, and they have to broaden out their hats? They have to add on a couple of extra hats. I mean, we've talked many times about what on earth does it mean to be strategic? And what do you think people struggle with, or what have you struggled with stepping into that top table environment?
I think so. Speaking for me and then speaking for others, what I've noticed, but speaking for myself, this idea of developing a view on the business, I found enormously challenging because the founder of 10 years that I worked with over at Mind Candy is a phenomenal thinker. And my brain does not work in the same way as his brain. So he would come up with ideas and I would think, how did he think about that? Where did that even come from? It was so way ahead of where I was thinking. And so then to be able to try and critically evaluate some of his ideas, I always felt a bit of a fraud. And then sort of educating myself and also validating that I did have something to bring to that. Actually, if I'm the person who's translating his strategy into execution, I have a lot to add here because I can see the pieces here, what will translate and what won't, what might be a better translation of it. So I have a lot that I can bring and I can add. And when I coach others, and again, I coach mainly COOs, but I do coach other C levels as well. I hear a lot that they get into an exec team situation and then they question what value they bring. So what value does my lens on this have? And they almost have to go through a process of understanding for themselves and accounting for the value that they bring before they can truly step into those strategic boots almost. And so really helping them to identify, well, you're on this exec team for a reason. The perspective you bring is super important. You run a whole area of this business that you are an expert in, but that means that the strategy has that lens over it for you. What does that look like? But also that they are now valued for how they're also thinking about things and not just how they're doing things. And I find that execs really struggle with this because then it's almost like they also struggle with the permissions that they have. But do I have permission to critique this? Do I have permission to say this? Do I have permission to challenge in this way? Is it okay to challenge the CEO? Is it okay that he or she may not, in my view, thought this through entirely? I think that can also be a real struggle, and a board level, 100% as well. Given, especially as you may have some people around that board who are incredibly experienced, then you're a bit like, who am I? So
I think
that's some
that's
of
such a powerful reminder, isn't it? That broadly speaking, everybody around that table is or has felt a bit unsure through to total imposter fraud type lack of confidence in what they bring, what their role is in that room, what they need to do or say or how to contribute in that team, regardless of your functional background, regardless of the role that you play within the business and all sorts of other things. I am comforted in some ways to hear that that's your experience too, because that certainly was my experience on a personal level, also continues to be the experience of many of my coaching clients, both within HR and outside of HR. It feels like it is a universal experience at the top table.
I also I think it's interesting. So I this kind of came to my mind because I've been working with somebody, an aspiring CFO recently. But even saying to them, "So what's your strategy for the finance department?" And sort of a bit of a blank look and a bit of a, I haven't really thought that through yet. I've been sort of too busy doing. You're like, okay, yes, get it.
Mm.
You're a really strong executor and you're really talented. But the next phase of this is that you then have to define what the future of this area is. So not even just the business strategy, but sort of these different areas within the business. What's the future of this? I suppose this is even more sort of pronounced at the moment with the introduction of AI and all of this other stuff. But where is this going? And what can you foresee and what stamp and legacy do you want to leave for this part of a business that may need improving or professionalizing or growing?
I think I love that one. I think that comes up a lot. And I often think about it in terms of where do you sit in the car? Because we can spend a lot of our careers sitting in the passenger seat. And yes, we're going on the journey. Somebody else is driving, someone else is navigating, someone else is deciding where the destination is. We just get in the car, show up, get in the car, get out the car when we get there. And then you shift into a kind of position of, well, navigation. Okay, I know I've been told where we need to get to. How are we going to choose our route? And then you might be the driver, which is, you're deciding exactly where I'm going to do this or that. I decide how fast we go. I decide how many people are on board. And you have to kind of shift your position in the car throughout your career, don't you, to start making those decisions. And it's funny when you think about people who don't drive and you say, well, can you navigate me to your house or something? And they go, well, I don't know. I never pay attention to how you get there because I never drive. And you think, what? How can you not know how to get somewhere? But it can be really telling, can't it? If it's like, well, I just do the doing. I just sit in the back seat all the time. Maybe I'm a brilliant doer. Maybe I'm brilliant at following instructions. But could I actually navigate? Could I actually decide what the destination is? It's a different position, isn't it?
I like your car analogy. That's really cool. I can steal it.
So do
I steal
I, so do I. It's
Oh,
great.
I'm sure there's more we can do with that.
I think there's also this myth in a way that that there's a golden handbook for being strategic, and you get the job, and then somebody hands you the golden handbook as you walk into that top table room for the first time, and all is well. And of course, there is no golden handbook, and everyone turns up feeling a little uncertain. I love the car analogy, but another analogy that I find really helpful is this idea of filling your own in tray. This idea that, we are operational through our careers, which means that in the old world, our in tray would be filled with tasks and things to do, and you've ticked them all off, and at the end of the day, you've maybe emptied your in tray. And then as you get more senior, your in tray is, broadly speaking, it's what you put in there. It's what you determine is the next task or thing to do. And that is a really different mindset shift for people and is very much part of being strategic, in my view, is this future vision. It's not just about defining and shaping the vision, but it's actually figuring out what the way there is and how to go about doing that. And that's a sort of filling your in tray analogy that I often think about.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think I was talking to you before about sort of, I see it as a bit of a hurdle, this, being sort of fed with tasks or what have you, and then being the feeder effectively. Y- And trying to make sure that people understand that the people I'm working with and coaching, that there is a distinct difference. They're being asked to make a significant shift in what they're
Mm.
doing and how they're thinking about things. I think is super important. Just being like, right, this is a change. We were also talking about that horrific piece of feedback that I have had very long time ago, and also some of my coaches have had when you get told you're not strategic enough, which that should be banned as a piece of feedback. But to me, rather, I'm like, I don't even believe that is what is meant by that piece of feedback. Somewhere along the way, some expectations are not being met. That's really what that piece of feedback is. But there's something about the level at which someone is working, which brings that strategic label into it somewhere. And I think when I was given that piece of feedback, it was at a point where I think the expectations were off kilter. It was like, right, you're now a very senior person. The expectation of you is X, but nobody had actually said that to me. So somehow you're expected to develop this in a vacuum, which I think is inherently unfair.
Well, I'm so glad you say that, because I've had that exact piece of feedback at quite a critical point in my career, and I didn't challenge what it meant. It wasn't clear what it meant, and I just went, "Oh yeah, sure, yeah, of course, absolutely, I'll go and do that." And then went away, wrote it down. I thought, well, how on earth does that mean? What does that look like? How will I know that I've done it? Who should I be modeling myself on? It's just not clear, and it feels to me like very poor quality feedback. But it's so interesting that it keeps coming up as something that people hear. And I guess like the only thing you can do, I guess, if somebody says that to you, you're not strategic enough or be more strategic, is to go back in with, okay, tell me, I want to know more about this. Tell me what you mean. Give me some examples. Tell me precisely where I'm falling short. Tell me precisely where I can up my game. Who's doing this really well? And just go straight back in with the, okay, I hear the words. Now tell me what you actually mean, because it's not helpful to hear, be more strategic, or you're not strategic enough. And can I just go back to something you said earlier on? And I think there's so much in it, in this big sense of being strategic. And Gemma and I have talked quite a lot about strategy comes in your timeline, like your time frame should be further away than it has been, and your perspective should kind of be higher up than it has been, so more of a big picture. But actually, you said something at the beginning about being valued for what you think rather than what you do, and shifting from that, I'm valued for doing stuff, and now I need to be valued for thinking stuff. And then you built on it further when you were describing that almost introverted, visionary founder. And can I be, what contribution am I making in terms of how I think in this room as part of this team? And am I allowed to challenge? Am I allowed to evaluate and rationalize what this visionary leader has said? And another thing that, again, is a vacuum, we're not given the playbook, we don't understand, is all of those behaviors that are needed within a senior leader, well, in any team, but particularly within a senior leadership team. We need the behaviors of, the leader who sort of sits on his own in his crazy workshop, drumming up an amazing idea and then dolloping it on the table. Then a COO or somebody like you is kind of going, okay, can we evaluate this against our strategy, against our objectives? Is this idea actually any good? And is it okay to say that? And then all the other roles that are needed. And I'm endlessly fascinated by this. This starts to pick up on the kind of Belbin team role work that I do a lot, but I was really interested in what you were describing about am I allowed to evaluate and put some kind of rational critique on what this founder has said, because you're describing so beautifully two clear Belbin team roles, and the fact that we don't always understand that there are lots of these roles that are needed in all of our conversations. They are all needed. They all have value. The challenge that I'm bringing, or the way that I think about something, or even the way that I communicate that to other people. All of these things have value over and above, have I delivered a project, that we're not really taught, or it's quite difficult to feel confident that, oh, is that okay? And is it valued? And should I keep doing it? Do you have any further perspective on how that works at the top table?
Well, this is an interesting one. I have a really big thing about understanding the stories of other operators who've sort of been there and done it. And this is how the COO roundtable actually started, really, was that I realized that I was just massively out of my depth. It's just like, I need to go and find people who've done this before, and then I can sort of hear their stories and try and ingest some of that. And what's fascinating about this is that in so doing, you then hear about how other people have learned to be strategic, and their perspectives on these different businesses they've been in. And it was almost a bit of a penny drop moment for me when I was like, oh, this is so interesting. So not only is this process that all of these folks who then go on to become really like amazing COOs and different and have exited huge businesses and all this. They've all gone through this transformation of being able to learn how to be strategic and have a really good working understanding of thought process around the businesses they're in and develop their own opinion. But also they've developed ways, and this is what kind of came into my head, they've developed ways of figuring out how they need to be strategic and what setup they need in order to do it. This lady that I was interviewing the other day for the roundtable, she's wonderful, she's the COO of Auto Trader, which is a really big PLC. And she was talking about how when she needs to sort of get into a really strategic mindset, she actually doesn't do it by herself. She'll take a bunch of really trusted people into a room with her, and to your roles, they then play different roles in her strategic thinking, and she knows what they bring. And again, this sort of is a bit of a meta representation of leadership teams, when actually really functional leadership teams, as you know from your team coaching, you have to feel like you've all got a role to play when you're hashing something through like this. So I feel like there's not only are you, is it about how you're thinking, but it's about who you're thinking with. And if you're in a very functional leadership team, have you taken the time to define what roles you play in sort of these thinking situations when you're hashing through things that you really need to decide on for the best interest of the business and with the CEO? And so there's something about that. The other thing that kind of struck me about this, by the way, is that I mentioned the internal external dynamic of a COO to CEO. That's only one. As in, there's this lovely article called The Misunderstood Role of the COO. It's a Harvard Business Review article. It's really fascinating, but it's all about how you get COOs who are effectively different roles, like the Belbin team roles, and they play a role against different personality types of CEOs. So you won't always get an external CEO. You might get a very sort of MD type CEO. And then what role does your COO play against that? So it's kind of really interesting, because then I feel like from a strategic perspective, they're all different types of thinking partners, effectively, with each other. So, I mean, I could go on about it endlessly, but I think it's super interesting thinking about how can strategy be functional in the business that you're in the exec team that you're in the board that you're in, and who plays what roles around the table for that.
Oh, that's so interesting. Are there any easy examples that you can think of that relate to those insights that those COOs had about their own strategic abilities, like a light bulb moment that you could share with us now?
I think my experience, because I transitioned from COO and I went into a CEO role, I've done it a couple of times actually. I guess my insight on this is that it was really crazy going from growing up in a company and sort of being a doer, and then so ticking my stuff off and doing my projects and everything. And then getting into the leadership team, being like, oh, right, okay, so I've got a strategic view. I've got to kind of come up with my own idea and opinion on what this looks like from a COO perspective. And then transitioning into CEO, being like, oh no, now I'm in a different seat entirely. And now I've got to come with something almost. I have to come to the table with something to discuss around the table with these folks and have them pitch in and discuss it with me. And I found that enormously confronting, because my brain, as I said, does not work that way at all. And having also been sat next to a very visionary founder for a long time, I was sort of in awe of him. And then I sat in his seat. It's like, what? So that was probably one of the biggest uncomfortable stretches of my entire career. And I'm not sure I navigated it particularly well. And put it this way, I guess from then on, and I was the CEO of that business probably for a couple of years, I decided that I really was a COO. I'm like, I really am a COO. I am not really a CEO. That's not really my identity. It's not really where I get my drive or any of that. But 40% of COOs transition into being CEO and remain. So it's a really interesting.
Yeah.
I think lots of them do go that way, because I think that they make this transition into having a view, and then they're a bit like, oh, but now I have a view. I sort of be the driver.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that as well, Divinia. I suppose as we come to the close of this episode, is there any advice that you would give people, someone getting ready to step into a strategic role? What sort of advice would you give them?
I think my number one piece of advice, and it's the number one piece of advice I give when I'm sort of coaching COOs who are transitioning and growing in their roles, is It's also a piece from, I'm a resilience coach, but it's sort of a piece of that got given in resilience coaching around how 65% of your time should be working on things, and then 35% should be thinking time. And I think it's really interesting from a COO context. So back to the define by doing, when you say to them, okay, so 35% of your time, you have to carve that out of your diary, and that's thinking time, because that will help you to be strategic, because you'll be thinking about the strategy for your department and your different areas, strategy for business, where it's all going, etc., etc. They look shocked, like, ugh, but that's loads of time. And I'm like, doesn't matter. Like 35% of your time, you got to carve it out. And so that's the piece that because even, okay, so 35% of time is a lot, but even if you manage to carve out 10%, 15%, 20%, it gets you on the road to thinking okay, so I have some blank space for thinking about things, and thinking about things from my own perspective, and coming up with my own opinions and judgments about the business.
That's so important, isn't it? Because that goes back to that idea about understanding where your value is. Somebody has to do some thinking.
Yes, exactly.
You have to think, and the higher you get, the closer you get to that top table, the more thinking that you need to do. So putting a figure on it, or a time, or even an aspiration for a time, is brilliant. That's a really practical piece of advice, which I love. Thank you for that, Divinia.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, it's been so wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Divinia. Is there anything that you want to share in relation to the COO Roundtable, just to let people know anything more about it? We'll obviously put some information in the show notes as well, but any last comments on that?
Yeah, just to say, we onboard cohorts for the roundtable 3 times a year, and we love having people come and join us, and so that they can also share in the roundtables and all the wonderful events that we do, and help them to sort of grow and change in their career as well, and meet lovely other COOs and other great people that they can then grow with.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Divinia, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Jem, for another lovely episode. I always appreciate working with you. And thank you most of all to our lovely listeners. Thank you for joining us again today, and we look forward to you joining us for another episode of The Strategic Leader really soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. We'd love it if you could subscribe, or maybe share with a colleague, or just leave us a quick review.
And if you have a big, hairy question you'd like us to explore, or perhaps a strategic dilemma you're wrestling with, just drop us a line, gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk.
And remember, having a strategic viewpoint doesn't necessarily mean having all the answers. It's more about asking better questions, broadening your view, and staying curious.
We'll see you next time.